Okay. I have it on good advice that all the tech is now working. So good evening. Hi, everyone. Hi to the panelists there. My name's Michael Berkman. I'm one of the Greens MPs here in Queensland. And before anything else, I want to acknowledge that I'm here on the country of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I want to acknowledge that they are the sovereign owners of this country. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And in a conversation like the one we are going to have tonight, it's so important to recognise the really long, dark history of colonisation and of dispossession and genocide all across the continent, and just how pertinent that is each and every day around the sorts of issues for First Nations communities that we're talking about. Look, the context of this stream tonight is that we have just last week introduced a bill here in the Queensland Parliament that proposes to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14. We want to use this as an opportunity to bring some really important voices into the conversation and some perspectives that can address the biggest concerns and the sorts of objections that folks routinely raise to this proposal of raising the age. It's not a radical proposal. We're a long way behind off the pace in Australia generally and in Queensland as well. But I guess that's the purpose, is just to kind of talk through it and recognise why it's so important for us to take this step and discuss why we've introduced the bill. Now we'll start with introductions. We have Sam Wheat from Turnstile is here translating what we say into Auslan for folks watching who might be deaf or hard of hearing. So welcome, Sam. Thanks for being here with us. I'll throw to each of the panelists to do a quick intro for themselves if they've got a minute. So we'll start first of all with Lidia Thorpe, who is a Green Senator for Victoria, the Australian Greens spokesperson for justice, and a Gunai Gunai Jaburang woman. So Lidia, thanks so much for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for putting on such an important event when, we know that so many of our babies are locked up right now when they should be home with their babies. I'm Lidia Thorpe. I'm a Senator for Victoria for the Australian Greens, and I am, as Michael said, a very proud, sovereign Gunai Gunditjmara and Djapurrung woman. And I live and work mainly on Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to all traditional owners who've maintained the resistance, the fight, and the determination to seek justice for our people for over 200 years, and obviously our land as well. So thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure, and thanks so much for taking the time. I should say we're obviously hoping in different circumstances that maybe we could have had an event like this in person, but really appreciate that you've taken the time to be here online. Next, I'll throw to Dorinda Cox, who is our newly sworn in, well, not quite yet sworn in Green Senator for WA. Dorinda's an anti-domestic violence campaigner, a Yamachi Noongar woman, and a former police officer. So Dorinda, take it away.
Thanks, Michael, and just want to echo Lydia's comments on how great it is to be having this important conversation online tonight, and say that I'm really glad to hear that the bill's been introduced in Queensland. As you said, I'm a proud Yamaji Noongar woman from Western Australia. I live and work on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also their emerging leaders, because we've got quite a few. And if we don't actually get good legislation and keep locking them up, they have the inability to lead in our communities, and that's such an important space for them. So I'm really glad to join you. As Michael also said, my background is policing and justice. I've been frontline police officer, but I've also worked in the areas of domestic violence and child sexual abuse, and also done some research and some policy work in that area. So looking forward to the conversation.
It's great. Such a wealth of experience, Dorinda. Such really interesting perspective you bring. So thanks again for joining. Ross Homel, last but not least, is a professor of criminology and justice at Griffith University and a spokesperson for the Justice Reform Initiative, which is doing some great work here in Queensland and around the country. So Ross, I'll give you a moment more to introduce yourself, if you would.
Thanks, Michael. And unfortunately, you can't find a professor of my age in criminology who has an Indigenous background. I wish you could have done, but I'm a mongrel mixture of European ancestry. And I've been for almost 30 years the foundation professor of criminology at Griffith, and I've had a passion for prevention of bad things happening to people for my entire career. In the last 20 or 25 years, I've had a particular focus on the conditions of life under which children are growing up in Australia, particularly in Indigenous and disadvantaged communities more broadly. And there is so much we could do as a society to create better conditions for our most disadvantaged children if we wanted to do it. There is so much evidence, there's so many strategies available, and that's really what my career has been about, trying to bridge that gap between science and service and demonstrate the feasibility of many of the good things that research tells us would work in real community contexts.
Yeah, wonderful. That's great. Thanks, Ross. Look, I should have said right at the outset that we're hoping to get as many questions as we can coming from the stream. So whatever platform you're watching on, please drop a question in the comments box, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of them as we can. I've got wow. Let's talk about starting with the the big broad question. The first question that's come in is, I think, directed to Ross, and it is, how will these issues be solved? So much talking about this, and no one has been able to help these kids and the victims of the crimes. Yeah, look, we'll start with a nice narrow question just to kick it off. Ross, do you want to jump in first? You happen to be unmuted, so take it away.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Yeah, that's a great question. What are we going to do? And that's exactly what I've tried to devote a lot of attention to over the last few years. We're talking particularly about children aged 10 to 13 who are caught up in the youth justice system, and some of whom are in detention. The key question is, how do we keep those young children out of the system? The best thing is to raise the age, but that still doesn't solve the problems that got those children into trouble in the first place. And so we need in a nutshell, all the evidence points to multiple strategies, working with families, with communities, through community co-creation strategies, but drawing on the best available evidence so that we work simultaneously across with individual children, their families and extended family, and the schools and preschools that they're involved with. And if we use evidence-based strategies that are enthusiastically endorsed and developed and adapted by local people, by elders and by representatives of the community and by the parents themselves or the carers, then we have the magic ingredients. The other magic ingredient is we need sufficient funding over a sufficiently long time period, I would say 10 years, starting in the very early years where young children are starting to manifest really difficult behaviours which make them a handful for their teachers, make it very difficult at home for them, and they become unpopular with their peers. There is so much we can do for those children who are always damaged by things like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or violence in their family or community settings. We don't need to go into all of the risk factors, but the point is we know how to work with families and communities in order to achieve very positive long-term outcomes. And I'm using a model called Fast Track that did precisely this in some of the toughest areas of the US in the first decade of actually the 1990s and the early 2000s. And by starting early and working in the way that I've described, they were able to reduce serious crime at age 30 by 31%, drug-related crime by 35%, and really amazing array of very positive outcomes for the families and the children, and a much better school environment as well for the schools that they attended. So it's win-win-win all around, and it was cost effective, even though it was very expensive and it was funded through various foundations. It's possible to do all of this in this wealthy country if we have the will to do it. And we need all the sectors working together, and it's not just government. We need the research, we need the researchers, we need the communities themselves to take control and to advocate for what they need and what their aspirations are. And we need the non-government organisations and so on to be fully involved in this. So it's multi-sectoral, multi-program, multi-pronged, and very much adapted to the needs of individual children and families and communities. It's a holistic, very flexible strategy that is founded on very good evidence. What more do we need?
Yeah,
except the will to bloody well do it.
I'll just read a comment that Leanne's put in response to Sean's question. Sorry, Sean's put in response to Leanne's question. He says, keeping kids in school will help them. Not putting them through the carceral system will help them. Better resources will help them. What you mean is incarceration has not helped these kids or victims of crime. It's pretty straightforward stuff in a lot of respects, isn't it? But look,
all the evidence shows that incarceration increases criminality. Incarceration is a very expensive way of making damaged children worse and actually reducing community safety.
Yeah, and look, I do always hesitate to bring it back to the dollars and cents, but one stat that blows my mind is that it costs $1,600 a day here in Queensland to incarcerate a single child, and that's more than $500,000 a year. But anyway, moving on, we've got another question from Amy on Facebook, which I'll throw to you, Lidia, if you're okay with that. Amy asks, how do we combat the notion that we need to punish or lock up kids to keep communities safe? And Emma's asked a similar question. How can misconceptions and tough on crime attitudes in the community be addressed?
Well, we have to get rid of the racism that's involved here. We are dealing with systemic racism at every level, including the media and how they portray these children, right? And they come from this position of fear, and they put fear into people. Of course, people are going to be afraid if the media are going out there saying, oh, there's all these naughty little black kids going around smashing people's windows and stealing their cars, whatever. What they're not hearing is some of the things that Ross mentioned, and looking at what is working out there and what has been working for thousands of generations. And that is, these kids need to be connected to family, community, culture, because they need their sense of belonging and self-worth. Now, my mother used to be the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, where that was probably 30 years ago now. We had cultural camps for all kids, whether they were in out-of-home care or locked up or, the boss's daughter. It was all community black kids coming together to learn who we were as black children and where we fit in this society. And that enabled us the tools that we needed to deal with racism, to have the confidence to participate in a racist society. So these children are missing out on the very essence of their identity and their connection, which ultimately creates a healthy environment, a healthy community, a healthy family. But when you have families who are dealing with deaths in custody, incarceration rates, stolen children, destruction of country, as a black woman whose own family's been touched by this, it is which priority do we wake up and fight on that day? So we, as Ross said, self-determination is key. Families need to self-determine what is best for them and their communities, but they need that, $1,600 a day to make it happen, because that's what you call, defunding the system and putting it into programs and solutions that are coming from the people and actually work.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I might just perch on that one for a bit longer. Dorinda, I'm interested in your take on this question as well. Like the tough on crime rhetoric and the idea that, that punishment needs to be part of the solution to problematic behavior in kids. What's your response to that? Because it is one of the most pervasive things that we have to kind of, any time I do an interview on this stuff or any time in a conversation, it's like there's this innate belief that we got to teach them a lesson. So how do you respond to that?
I think, Lydia's spot on. There's the systemic racism issue that we have to deal with. There's also the unconscious bias and conscious bias that exists at an individual level. So being a former police officer, I have seen racism firsthand, and I've seen police officers target Aboriginal kids. And so, because it's an easy picking, right? You can go up to an Aboriginal child and you can be in their face, and you can, just your mere presence is about triggering the intergenerational trauma for these kids. It is, and I can safely say that because in my family, we're fifth generation of stolen kids. So becoming a police officer was, and I've said it in the media last week, my grandmother immediately asked me whether I would remove children as a police officer, because that was her reality. And intergenerationally, we're triggering that every time we see a blue uniform, every time we are approached by police, followed on the streets, them driving behind us. And we still inherently tell our children, Ballet, there's the monarch, like we talk like that to them, to be fearful. And so what that does is, for us collectively, it still creates that the fear that we have when we are confronted with police. But this is a system that was introduced to us. It's not part of our law and culture. That is an old system. This is a Western system that believes if you criminalise and you shame people publicly, that will stop them reoffending. And so, locking up children or punishing them is the belief that they will stop offending. But what we're not getting to is the root cause of that. We're not getting to the trauma that exists and lays dormant, particularly that's what the Canadians call the blood memory of families. It's passed on through their DNA, through their epigenetics. It's a genetic thing. So we can't ignore that. And I think that when we don't do that work around trauma-informed practice with even police forces across this nation, we are ignoring the fact that Aboriginal people, First Nations people in this country have a really deficit-based history with justice and everything that represents justice. And I concur with Ross's comments around dismantling that school to prison pipeline, and making sure that we get in front of that, because that's really, really important. And what I see is that there needs to be much more healing around that, and understanding that trauma plays itself out. When we look at that in the context of children's offending behaviour, most of them are in survival mode. I remember being in a research consultant position only a few years ago and visiting a remote WA town, and the police officers telling us that there's a gang of youth. And my immediate question was, have they labelled themselves a gang? And they said, well, that's what we're calling them. And I said, well, if you call them that, that's what they will be. They will obviously then know that you've labelled them in that way. The second part of that was that they were committing burglaries, so they were breaking into the local roadhouse. And I asked them what they stole, and they said they stole chips and chocolate worth $10,000. And I said, so what does that tell you about the poverty that exists in this town? This is a mining town, and the disparity of wealth. So we have kids that are in survival mode. They're traumatised by what's happening in their households, in their communities, and we're not doing anything to, one, basically provide for their immediate needs, but also to look at the recovery and trauma models and healing that need to be enacted through those processes.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'll move on to the next question. Oh God, we got a few coming in. I'll jump. So maybe this kind of touches on some issues you've raised, Dorinda, as well as Ross. But maybe we'll start with Ross. Sean on Facebook's asked, are there efforts to provide disability services to kids in prisons, especially Indigenous kids who are less likely to be diagnosed? And I mean, I'm interested. We heard some pretty shocking stats coming out of WA in the recent committee hearing about the proportion of kids, really young kids being incarcerated who have FASD or in some cases undiagnosed. So I guess that's a big part of this issue. So maybe Ross, you have some thoughts first, or Dorinda, if you've bring that WA perspective.
Dorinda, do you want to go first?
Happy for you to go first, Ross, and then I'll.
Okay. Well, look, Michael was just referring to, I think, the Institute Child Health Research study about 3 years ago in the Banksia Hill Detention Centre. 88 kids or 89 kids, as I recall, were fully assessed. It was a really major study. Found 36% of the children were suffering from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and 89% from memory had at least one serious neurodevelopmental disorder, which was documented in the article, which is open access and published. That's a foundational study. I've talked with the Director General of Youth Justice here in Queensland and the Minister a few months ago about replicating that study and extending it in Queensland. I think they accepted my argument that whatever the detail of doing that, they need to invest much more heavily in very careful, thorough assessment of the children, particularly young children that come into their care. So I would be amazed if we didn't have very similar results in Queensland to that Banksia Hill study, particularly up north in Cleveland, the Cleveland Detention Centre. But we don't really have the data. And so I can't directly answer the question how many children in the system here in Queensland are suffering from this disability or that disability. And I really don't know as an outsider, and I suppose I could probe and find out what services are available to those who are known to have a disability. It's very recent years that the clinical work's been developed to work with FASD kids, but it can be done. In Perth, at the end of 2019 at the Criminology Conference, Harry Blagg organised a number of sessions, including clinical psychologists who work with these kids, actually showing it's possible to teach skills, to teach appropriate behaviour, whereas a few years ago we thought it was all over Red Rover once someone's brain was badly damaged in that way. So I could talk all night, so I'm going to stop.
Happy to follow up Ross's comments that there's a large percentage of kids, particularly in our juvenile detention centre, and the study that Ross has referred to in relation to Banksia Hill. There are programs and there's been training within the Department of Justice here around the management of FASD in particular for young people. One of the really key things that's probably part of that is that of FASD is the lack of empathy that people believe kids with FASD have. And when you talk to victims then in that context of a child with FASD has committed a burglary and they have no remorse or show no remorse, and as a police officer conducting an interview with a young person or a child, the immediate thing that you look for is their level of remorse in relation to the crime that's been committed. So when you think of overlaying that with FASD, immediately police officers think this kid doesn't even care, that they've smashed up someone's house, they've gone in while people are at home, all of those sorts of things, which creates that angst and those stereotypes, and it plays into the narrative, the deficit and negative narrative particularly about First Nations kids. And so we do need proper diagnosis, but it can't just stop there. It actually needs to go further in relation to services and programs. Helps with families too, because lots of families don't actually know how to manage and support kids with FASD, and it looks like bad parenting from the outside. And when you think about the intergenerational again, lack of diagnosis of FASD. Some of this is also the parents and grandparents that are carers for some of these children. So it's a huge management process that needs to be rolled out, I think, as part of NDIS or something within the system that allows us to actually tackle this on as Ross said, a multi-sectorial sort of approach that can't just be about justice in isolation. That we need to actually do more and to think more innovatively about some of those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so easy to hear the kind of judgment rolling in when people see whatever media coverage on issues like this, and there's the complete lack of context around that. But also, you really drive home the point that this one little legislative tweak of raising the age is in fact nothing more than a platform for all of the rest of the the diverse institutional work that has to be done. I want to throw to you now, Lidia, if I could. We've got a question from Jeff. Starts with a comment. Great to see the presentation. Jeff notes that corrections and justice are state areas. So the question is there some plan to finally reach a nationwide best scenario so that strategies, the foster system, and other issues are to be nationalised and standardised in response? Is that, I guess, it's a bit of detail in the question, but I mean that complexity around the state ownership of different issues and federal funding of various supports that come into the conversation. How do you see that being dealt with and playing out?
Well, we certainly need national leadership. This is a national crisis, and if we look at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, for example, coming up to its 30th year, then it's solutions that are in those recommendations that we have been demanding be implemented for 30 years. So we need national leadership on this, and we know that some states and territories are worse than others. But yeah, I'd like to see a national framework or a principle that ensures that things like what Ross and Dorinda have already mentioned, the systemic racism, the unconscious bias, and that holistic approach to looking at the child. So rather than looking, at fixing the child, we need to look at the whole family, but we also need to look at what is impacting that whole family and ensure that federally, that it all aligns. I mean, the government is so screwed up, and so they have no idea what they're doing. They write up a piece of legislation at the 11th hour, ram it through. They do not look at the human rights consequences in a lot of these bills, and because they have the numbers on these committees. I sit on one of these committees, and human rights issues are raised all the time. But because they have the numbers on the committee, it's just sidelined. It's not really important, because we've got to get this bill passed, and then they get Labor's support, and what do you know? It's too late. Deal's done. So we need to pressure the feds here to ensure that there's a coordinated response that everybody adheres to, because this is our children. Imagine if our white babies being taken like this at the rate that they're taken and incarcerated at the rate that they're taken. You'd have freedom rallies in the middle of Melbourne, wouldn't you now? So, yeah, I'd like to see that. Yeah,
absolutely. A bit of a change of tack. I'm interested in asking, so Lidia and Dorinda, there was a question here about, so Glennis has asked, what about ensuring that our communities have activities for all children that are free? Clubs, camps, free pools, free club sport, free public transport, etc. Now I see Ross nodding as well, so I'm interested in his take once we've heard from you. But that raises for me an interesting question about the really fundamental disadvantage that a lot of these remote communities or even just regional communities are facing. These sorts of facilities are might seem like a pipe dream to some of those communities. But so what are the basics? What are the first steps in terms of that kind of community service and actually providing meaningful activities for kids to engage with community? So I don't know, Lidia, I've just given you a run, but sorry, I should have given you some warning on that one.
Sorry, look, you just need to look at some of the other Greens policies, right? We want mental health and dental into Medicare. There's, we've got to look at this holistic approach. And I know it's hard for some people to fathom, but Dorinda and I grew up that way. You've got to fix the whole of us, not just parts. And my experience as a sports person and as a junior coach, living at Lake Tyers, the buses were taken off the community at Lake Tyers. The kids couldn't get to basketball to go and play basketball with the white kids in town. What did that do? That created division because the black kids couldn't get to town because the government took the buses. We had 2 black kids out of 500 kids at the East Gippsland Little Athletics because it's so expensive and they couldn't get there. So if you talk about little towns like that where tensions are high and removal of children rates are high, then you've got to dig deep and see what are these kids doing, what do they have access to, and how is the local footy club or the local surf club? If they're belonging to the right-wing faction, you've got no hope. Don't send your kids there. And I've experienced that and stood up to so many black kids that have had to deal with the racism in every sport and every recreational opportunity that was available to them in these small country towns. So yes, it should be free. Yes, it should be accessible, but it's also got to be safe and free from racism.
Yeah, Dorinda?
I think the other point in that is that it's become very industry driven. So it's become quite commercialised and competitive in relation to competing for funding, right? We've seen the funding streams really tighten up in relation to the investment in sports. And what we've done is we've almost laden that with a concept of telling our kids you could be that 1 in 100,000 AFL star. And so what that means is we set our kids up for an expectation that if they go to Auskick, they're going to be an AFL footballer. And the fall from grace in that is a real disappointment, for lots of our children. And that's because we're not making it accessible, but we're not making it affordable also. And we're not building spaces that build that resilience for our kids, as Lidia said. That is about being able to tackle racism, but also to have supportive structures where if our families and our parents call out racism, they're also supported by the system. So here in Western Australia, I've got lots of constituents that have written to me and sent me messages on Facebook about the WA Football Commission, who constantly, our kids are playing in local footy groups and are being racially vilified. And when they report that to the umpires or even to the commission, they're not being supported with complaints. So when a system doesn't recognise that, what hope do we have, even if it is free for our kids? Because our kids get disheartened, our parents get disheartened, and they get angry. And I would be angry too if my kid was on the receiving end of that. And so what ends up happening is it's usually played out in a violent way because that's their retaliation in relation to that is using violence. So, we need to be thinking much more creatively about how we make it free, but as Lidia said, make it accessible, but also making it supportive for our communities and to be culturally safe and free of that influence of commercialisation and industries that are not doing the right thing by First Nations communities. Here in WA, we've had Rio Tinto blowing up caves, but yet they want to put their name and their branding all over the back of football jumpers for our kids. So there's a real tension about making investment, but also doing the right thing. What's the social license and what's ethical that's going to be led by community? So our community controlled organisations, and Victoria have got some great ones, are really important to make that investment in their local clubs rather than lifting it to a glamorous, led by an ex-athlete, that isn't going to hit the ground and have the same impact for our young people. So I'm very concerned that that's something that's continuing to creep in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's absolutely no way to separate the broader influence of capital and capitalism on the way that these programs are and aren't made available, but also this insidious racism that just sits everywhere in at grassroots level in communities. Ross, I don't mean to deprive you of a chance to answer that last question, but I wanted to throw a different question to you. Katrina asked the question, can Ross give specific examples of success stories? How do you dismantle systemic racism? How do you get kids to stay in school? How do you help traumatized families, including parents, heal? So, given your, the depth of your academic and, your background in the research, what does that tell us about those questions?
Well, we just need to do what I described at the beginning. Keeping young children in school is absolutely critical. We know that. Once they start getting suspended and then expelled, it's a very bad future that is not necessarily, risk is not destiny, but it's not a good start to life. There are lots of things that do help kids to stay at school. One thing that schools can do is help kids to stay at school, actually make the school experience more positive. But we have found in our work that schools frequently are unaware of bullying that's going on in the playground, but it's not being observed by the teachers. And that includes racialized bullying. We've invented, or my very clever colleague, Kate Freiberg at Griffith, has invented a way of measuring through an interactive computer game the social and emotional well-being of primary age children. And about 25,000 Australian kids have now engaged in playing this game, which they love. And that includes, I think, about 20% are Indigenous kids, including from some remote Indigenous communities, and they love it as well. But what the data generated by the game does is give the school the clear data that they need to understand the needs of the children in the school, in terms of not of academic performance particularly, but in terms of how they're interrelating with their friends, how their capacity for emotion regulation, cooperating rather than hitting back when they don't get what they want, and so on and so on. And we've found that those schools that have discovered, for example, that nearly a quarter of their children report through the game anonymously that they don't feel safe at school. That particular school that reported this to us said, well, they immediately sat down and they didn't panic. They sat down, talked to the kids, discovered this racialized bullying problem going on, and they developed a whole pastoral care program in that school to deal with it. That's putting genuine, reliable data into the hands of schools in this case, which empowers them then to act on the voices of children through that game environment. Now, that's just one example of how we can help schools help kids to stay engaged. And for young children, engagement at school isn't that they look forward to the lessons, it's their friends. It's how they get on with other kids. It's the positive experience of going every day. That includes having breakfast, having a full stomach when they arrive at school, which we know many kids don't. So there's multiple things that can be done just to scaffold around schools the resources that they need, including good data. But yes, they do need funding. Schools can't do it all on their own. But we can provide the supports through NGOs and through the community itself. It's got to be controlled by the community. And after all, it's the parents who have the most stake in the future of their children. And so the power has to be put in their hands to advocate for the sorts of things I'm talking about. And that includes programs that promote positive youth development. And if you're encountering that kind of racism that Dorinda described, then that's a political struggle. That's got to change. That institutional racism. I'm shocked to hear that. I'm not surprised, but I'm shocked. I still get shocked after 50 years of working in this field.
Yeah, it is shocking, and it kind of needs to remain shocking. That, I mean, the broader questions asked there about how do we dismantle systemic racism. I mean, how long's that conversation? How long we got?
What we do know is that the experience of racism by children is toxic in its effects, and there's very good evidence on that now. So this is really, really important. If we're serious about the future of our children and the future of this country, this is a fundamental problem to deal with. It's got to be you politicians that take the lead. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, we just need more Black voices in Parliament, and we need more women in Parliament, and we need politicians that represent good policies. So, you know, people need to do their homework on who they vote for. If everybody in this country just did that, then you probably see a whole new government completely and see a whole Green government in place. And I'm not just saying that as a Greens, but the policies are about just, you know, breaking down systemic racism. It's about self-determination. It's about a treaty that we need to have in this country, given, you know, we were invaded over 200 years ago. There's never been any agreement. There's never been a treaty, and we're one of only a few Commonwealth countries in the world that does not have one of those. So, you know, that is a blank canvas that this country could grasp and take on as the treaty of the 21st century that ensures that there is no more inequality and injustice, not just against blackfellas, but against everybody in this country. We need a human rights bill. You know, there's so many things that this government will never do because it's just not, they're so out of touch, and they're so in their bubble of looking after themselves that they don't think in that community space or family space. So yeah, we need good people in Parliament. That's it. Get these crusty old white people, and no offense, Ross, but you know the ones I'm talking about, that they have no idea, and they are there for the wrong reasons. And look where they're sending us right now. They're sending us into a war, a climate catastrophe, you know, the pandemic, you name it. So we have an opportunity to change the government and put the Greens in balance of power.
Can I also just make a comment on the
back? Please do.
Lydia's wonderful spiel. But I also think we need to introduce some new language as part of that. And I think the treaty process is one of those. I think if people truly committed to the reconciliation journey, they have to start talking about anti-racism. Like, I think the set of principles that Lidia was talking about earlier in the conversation have to be anti-racist. We can't continue to just be culturally aware or culturally safe. You know, we have to be anti-racist. And I know that, you know, the Australian and New Zealand Policing Association have a set of anti-racism principles. And I think enforcement or, you know, implementation of those at a national level can be actually measured then, but there's no actual, you know, want to do that because everyone's waving around the Reconciliation Action Plan saying they're doing enough. And we actually need to do more. We actually need to enshrine, you know, those sets of principles of anti-racism to challenge people's behaviour. We need to measure, you know, and have data that's available. And I was glad that Ross mentioned the sort of data sovereignty issue about giving people, you know, the data to actually make good decisions about, you know, putting programs and processes in place for our kids. And one of the things that I've been talking to WA Police about, you know, a couple of years ago was we had data that looked at what we used to call in policing the trifecta. So the disorderly conduct, resist arrest, and assault public officer is what we call the trifecta. And if you looked across your history of policing arrests, you could actually see people who have targeted Aboriginal people or First Nations people, and a very glaringly obvious conscious bias in their way of policing practice. And so what you do is target that through a training process and a professional development process, because we do it in every other workplace in the public sector, but we're not doing this in our policing jurisdictions. So I think it's a really practical thing that we can use with data to actually inform the systemic racism that continues to manifest itself, but it's also a cultural process that's allowed to be endorsed by particular people's behaviour, and we've got to challenge that. And I think once we put anti-racism principles into action, we will actually see a difference.
Yeah, great suggestions. I mean, turning our opposition of racism into an active practice in workplaces and in our public conversations, really, it almost seems too simple in some respects, but we're clearly not there, right? It hasn't happened. Look, I'll just give one quick plug at this point for any final questions. We've probably only got about less than 10 minutes now to keep asking questions. So if you've got a burning question on any of the feeds you're watching on, just get it in the comments box, quick, smart, and we'll get to it if we can. While we're talking the politics of this, I've got a question for Lidia about just that, about political will. So Amanda's asked, is there really political will to approach this issue when media highlights the negative outcomes only? They respond to calls for tougher measures to appease the public, which it's a great question. And it's, I think, maybe the biggest uphill battle we've got with the bill that we've introduced here in Queensland is this, this conservative media, the rhetoric that they just keep pumping out and the way that really dictates terms to scared politicians. Interested in your take, Lidia.
Yeah, it is a good question. Look, I think that there is political will, and there's certainly in the Liberal Party some of the senators that I've spoken to personally support raising the age. So there are a couple of, women mainly, who support it. So I think the more we apply the pressure on every politician to follow suit, then, it might be possible. But I think that, we've got a government that is all about saving money and spending money in inappropriate places. So if we're going to come up with facts and figures, which is what they like, and go out to the taxpayer and say, well, actually, it's costing us more to lock up these kids than it is to keep them at home, and have some good messaging around that. We can't help that, we also have to deal with a racist media in the Murdoch media that love this stuff. And unfortunately, that's not going to go away, right? So we just have to put pressure on Labor, particularly because they buckle at the last minute. And that's really devastating when you are talking to some of your colleagues in Labor that just feel really uneasy about voting for something that they genuinely don't agree with. So we have to also put pressure on these Labor politicians to support Greens motions or bills to get the work done. And yeah, I think the political will is there. We've got to pull it out, because they're all frightened to say anything, because it is a race to the bottom between Labor and Liberal. So if we make them feel good about themselves, and you are a constituent, you are a taxpayer, it's got to be up to the people at the end of the day, rather than the politicians to apply the pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a fascinating interplay between politicians who might personally hold a position, whether they're stymied because of party or fear of party retribution or media backlash or whatever it is. And we've got that particularly toxic landscape here in Queensland with just the single outlet in the Courier Mail. But
Michael, can I make a comment about the way this problem is framed in the public sphere? And that's really what we've been dancing around for some of this discussion this afternoon. I don't think the cost-benefit arguments carry a lot of weight really with the public, because they don't understand those sorts of figures. What I think the best strategy in terms of getting political traction is to emphasize the community safety benefits of all of the things we've been talking about. At the end of the day, people don't want to have their houses broken into. They don't want to be confronted in the streets by kids with knives. They don't want their cars stolen, or in some cases torched, because the kids can't get into the car. if you emphasize that it's those problems which are extremely serious, and I would understand why people get very upset when that happens to them. It's happened to me. I had my car stolen during the school holidays some years ago from the university campus. It ended up without wheels in front of the football club in the community we're actually working in with our early intervention work, which was all very ironic. I understand how people feel. We've got to be able to empathise with the victims of crime and say, look, if you want to create a safer community, punishment is not the way to go. And incarcerating young kids is not the way to go, because it will actually make the community less safe, because you're damaging children more. And I think we just have to keep hammering the message that we've got to draw on science, and we've got to put the data and the control into the hands of communities who understand their own issues and their own problem. So it's got to be a joined up solution that empowers the critical players to to enact all of the programs and positive development stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we, according to the run sheet.
Sorry, it's Dorinda.
Yes, please
Can I
do.
just make a comment on in all the advocacy that I've done with politicians here in WA. The thing about it is that opening a new prison and opening a new detention centre is about cutting a ribbon, right? Let's not dance around that. And they love to do that, politicians, and particularly when it comes close to election time. So what we've learned in the family violence sector is that the prevention work is the hardest, and what Ross is saying is it's how we present this issue and how we constantly talk about it. But we also have to present a cost-benefit analysis, and the work that Harry Blagg and I have done together here for WA Police has been about sending kids back on country. But you can't send them back on country when country doesn't exist anymore. So we can't separate those issues from each other. And so, yeah, thanks, Ross. We have to have a conversation about what does that actually look like, and presenting that argument of that $1,600 a day and building a prison, and which is essentially is what it is for young people, to have them incarcerated is not a good financial or economic decision in a budget. And so we actually have to have another option that's just as flash or sexy or appealing for a politician to want to actually hold up and actually say that this is unannounceable and this is what we're actually going to invest in. So, it's about smart justice, and it's about making those decisions that are about, and particularly for us as First Nations people, how we get that identity healing that comes from being on country, and to heal what's happened in a traumatic way for previous generations of our children and young people.
Absolutely. Look, we're getting close to time here, and I'm going to try very hard not to run us over, but I guess it's almost sounded like summing up, but I really did want to give each of you a couple of minutes just to give us your last few thoughts, like just a couple of minutes each. We've covered an awful lot of territory to cover here. But ultimately, we as politicians, the work is clearly ours to do. I guess I'm interested, any final thoughts and, next steps for us in our roles individually about how we continue to tackle, all of these issues, but especially the specific question of getting really young kids out of watch houses and detention centres. Lidia, if you're happy to go first.
I think it's all been pretty much said as to what we can be doing, and particularly about putting pressure on politicians. As a politician, I know that, I have to respond to everybody that writes to me or calls me, and I have to have a position about their particular issue. So politicians can't get away with not answering to the people that they say that they serve. So, don't be afraid to do that. And I just wanted to end with a little story, I suppose, when I did work at Lake Tyers, where my mum lives. It's an old mission reserve where we were rounded up in the old days. And cross country was coming to school. And so I got all the kids to meet me at the Aboriginal Training Centre, which was a facility which is a white elephant because it wasn't funded. So there's just, empty shell out there. Those kids turned up every day after school in gumboots, barefoot, and we run around the mission. And all the families came out of their homes and cheered on these kids that were preparing for their cross country. We went down to the cemetery for our rest because I said you can go and give your love to your family. They'd go and quickly say a couple of words at each of their families' graves, have a drink of water at the cemetery, and then we'd go off again running around the mission. And it was the whole community loved that. They loved to see their children being occupied and being, given an activity that they loved, and they went back to school and they were prepared for their cross country with the runners and everything, because I told them they needed runners and they couldn't run in gumboots. But just that experience on the ground and seeing kids thrive when they are on country and thrive when they see their family are proud of what they're doing, and just being connected to culture and their aunties and community. It just, it makes that child wholesome, and it gives those children someone to come to if they are struggling. And those kids are now adults and they still come, so that's, and they've all got jobs, they've been able to, some didn't, some don't have jobs, but I suppose the moral of the story is our children are our children, and no government has the right to lock up our babies the way that they are. And we as people in this country have to fight harder and call it out and contact your politician, because it can't be just the black politicians like Dorinda and I continuing to call it out, because it's just like, oh, here they go again, looking after their own. So we need everybody on board to do this, because we know what can happen from raising a beautiful, healthy child in a beautiful, loving environment.
Absolutely. Beautiful, Lidia. Thanks. Dorinda, are you happy to jump in next? Any final thoughts or observations?
Yeah, I think one of the really key things that I'd love to see and hopefully in my lifetime in politics, I can achieve this with Lidia and some of our other First Nation senators working alongside us, is to decolonise the system, is to actually stop pigeonholing things, in a way that is about the typology. It seems it's very rigid, it's very inflexible. The Attorney General's in charge of justice and therefore only funds justice programs. We don't see things in their entirety. And for us as First Nations people in particular, our Indigenous knowledge comes from everything being interconnected. So for me, it's how do we decolonise the system? And as Lidia said, it's for our future generations, and I think the decisions we make now affect the next 5 generations for us, and we have to hold on to that. But also it's for the broader public, it's for the broader society can learn from us. We're a surviving nation of people that has survived here for 65,000 years, and I think we haven't done too bad a job protecting country and protecting our people and protecting our law. So I think we need to decolonise our systems in a way that we can present first and foremost some of the interconnected issues and the way that we would tackle them that isn't about being segmented or being pigeonholing in different spaces. And it's hard when you've got ministers who are responsible for them. But what I don't see is that they actually work together in a cohesive way to understand how important that is. And we talk about intersectionality. So I could be a black woman who's a single mother with children with a disability, but no one really accommodates all of my needs at once. So this is how we don't see the world. We don't see it in a way that is helpful. In fact, it's harmful. And so when we think about what that does for our children and our young people, we need to change that from the highest level. So that's our big job as politicians, and decolonising means stripping that down to the bare roots of it and to its foundations and actually rebuilding it. So it's a tough job, but hopefully we can get there in the end.
We've got to be up for the job before we can get it done, I suppose, haven't we? Ross, any closing thoughts from you?
I'm a pathological optimist. I actually believe that this country can change. It's going to be your generation that takes the lead. I'm just about done. But I'm a scientist, a social scientist. My original training was in science. I believe in research and data, and I have confidence that when we put the power into the hands of communities, they will be more effective advocates for what works than governments are, because they live in the places that are going to get better when all of the sensible things are done to address the real needs of children. I'll stop because it's 7 o'clock, but there you go.
Michael, can I just say, Ross, thank you for all the work that you've done. It's incredible. And you're an amazing ally, and it's great to have you on our team. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's just get the job done, to quote somebody.
Pathological optimism is a fantastic note to finish on, I have to say. Look, it has been such a pleasure to be able to host this event tonight. I can't tell you how grateful I am to everyone who's joined online and engaged with us that way, and to Lidia and Dorinda and Ross. Thank you so much for being here, and Sam for making sure that everyone can tune in. I'll just very quickly touch on some next steps for this bill. It's a fairly long process for the committee hearing that's underway at the moment. So it'll be heard, there'll be an inquiry through the Community Support and Services Committee. Submissions on the bill they don't close until the 30th of November. So we've got lots of time to rustle them up and get submissions in on the bill. But of course, that's just one way to take action. I think the point's been really well made, especially by Lidia, that we need individual people to chase up with their local MP. It's Queensland MPs who are going to have to actually make this happen. So make sure you don't miss the opportunity to badger them about it. And anyone getting reform like this done, it relies on a lot of momentum, a lot of community engagement. So if you're interested in keeping engaged with this particular campaign on this bill, you can email me or the Mayway Electorate Office. We'll be sure to set out more steps you can take later. If you sign up for the email updates, there'll be a link in the comments. So we'll make sure that we keep you posted. There's another, there's a hashtag campaign. Post a photo of yourself at 10 with hashtag raise the age, because I think, if there's any way we can reach people's humanity, it's just to remind them that they were a 10-year-old kid at one point in time, right? Look, again, my most heartfelt thanks to all of you. It's been a great discussion. We're certainly a long way from done with it, but I look forward to hopefully an exciting 6 months where we can keep pushing this reform through. All right.